Continuing Marcus Cato from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Cato, as it plainly appears, was never oversparing of his own praises, and seldom shunned boasting of any exploit, which quality indeed he seems to have thought the natural accompaniment of great actions. And with these particular exploits he was highly puffed up. He says that those who saw him that day pursuing and slaying the enemies were ready to assert that Cato owed not so much to the public as the public did to Cato. Nay, he adds that Manius, the consul, coming hot from the fight, embraced him for a great while, when both were all in a sweat, and then cried out with joy that neither he himself, no, nor all the people together, could make him a recompense equal to his actions. After the fight he was sent to Rome, that he himself might be the messenger of it, and so with a favourable wind he sailed to Brundusium, and in one day got from thence to Tarentum, and having travelled 4 days more, upon the fifth, counting from the time of his landing, he arrived at Rome, and so brought the first news of the victory himself, and filled the whole city with the joy and sacrifices, and the people with the belief that they were able to conquer every sea and every land. And honestly, wait, the news would have been whatever, but wait if, for others to speak well of you. If they speak bad about you, defend yourself, but just rushing to, oh, I am so great, and all this other stuff. I have to hear that stuff way too much from individuals. These are pretty nearly all the eminent actions of Cato related to military affairs. In civil policy, he was of opinion that one chief duty consisted in accusing and indicating criminals. He himself prosecuted many, and he would also assist others who prosecuted them, nay, would even procure such, as he did the Petilii against Scipio, but not being able to destroy him by reason of the nobleness of his family and the real greatness of his mind, which enabled him to trample all calumnies underfoot, Cato at last would meddle no more with him. Yet, joining with the accusers against Scipio's brother Lucius, he succeeded in obtaining a sentence against him, which condemned him to the payment of a large sum of money to the state, and being insolvent and in danger of being thrown into jail, he was, by the interposition of the tribunes of the people, with much ado dismissed. It is also said of Cato that when he met a certain youth who had effected the disgrace of one of his father's enemies, walking in the marketplace, he shook him by the hand, telling him that this was what we ought to sacrifice to our dead parents, not lambs and goats, but the tears and condemnations of their adversaries. And yeah, don't worship them when they're dead. Don't worship them as deities when they're dead. Carry on some good legacy. And why do their enemies have to be crying and humiliated and stuff like that? But neither did he himself escape with impunity in his management of affairs, for if he gave his enemies the least hold, he was still in danger and exposed to be brought to justice. He is reported to have escaped at least 50 indictments, and one above the rest, which was the last, when he was 86 years old, about which time he uttered the well-known saying that it was hard for him who had lived with one generation of men to plead now before another. Neither did he make this the least of his lawsuits, for 4 years after, when he was 80, he accused Servilius Galba, so that his life and actions extended we may say, as Nestor's did over 3 ordinary ages of man, for having had many contests, as we have related, with Scipio the Great about affairs of state, he continued them down to Scipio the Younger, who was the adopted grandson of the former and the son of that Paulus who overthrew Perseus and the Macedonians. 10 years after his consulship, Cato stood for the office of censor, which was indeed the summit of all honor, and in a manner the highest step in civil affairs, for besides all other power, it had also that of an inquisition into everyone's life and manners, for the Romans thought that no marriage or rearing of children, nay, no feast or drinking bout, ought to be permitted according to everyone's appetite or fancy, without being examined and inquired into, being indeed of opinion that a man's character was much sooner perceived in things of this sort than in what is done publicly and in open day. Well, one of the definite, kind of related, kind of not right, one of the phanom, the fanatic, one of the definitions of that is somebody, oh, well, they go to the temple. They have a religion in the house of worship. Outside the place? No, they don't. That's a fanatic. They chose, therefore, 2 persons, one out of the patricians, the other out of the commons, who were to watch, correct, and punish, if any one ran too much into voluptuousness, or transgressed the usual manner of life of his country, and these they called censors. They had power to take away a horse or expel out of the Senate anyone who lived intemperately and out of order. It was also their business to take an estimate of what every one was worth, and to put down in registers everybody's birth and equality, besides many other prerogatives, and therefore the chief nobility opposed his pretensions to it. Jealousy prompted the patricians, who thought that it would be a stain to everybody's nobility if men of no original honor should rise to the highest dignity and power, while others, conscious of their own evil practices and of the violation of the laws and customs of their country, were afraid of the austerity of the man, which in an office of such great power was likely to prove most uncompromising and severe, and so, consulting among themselves, they brought forward 7 candidates in opposition to him, who sedulously set themselves to court the people's favor by fair promises, as though what they wished for was indulgent and easy government. Cato, on the contrary, promising no such mildness, but plainness, threatening evil livers from the very hustings, openly declared himself, and exclaiming that the city needed a great and thorough purgation, called upon the people, if they were wise, not to choose the gentlest, but the roughest of physicians. Such a one, he said, he was, and Valerius Flaccus, one of the patricians, another. Together with him, he doubted not but he should do something worth the while, and that by cutting to pieces and burning like a hydra all luxury and voluptuousness, well, typically you don't think of a water snake as doing that sort of thing, but of course that's us, it's not them that thinks that. But he added too that he saw all the rest endeavoring after the office with ill intent, because they were afraid of those who would exercise it justly as they ought, and so truly great, and so worthy of great men to be its leaders was, as it would seem, the Roman people, that they did not fear the severity and grim countenance of Cato, but rejecting those smooth promisers that were ready to do all things to ingratiate themselves, they took him together with Flaccus, obeying his recommendations, not as though he were a candidate, but as if he had the actual power of commanding and governing already. Cato named as chief of the Senate his friend and colleague, Lucius Valerius, Flaccus, and expelled, among many others, Lucius Quintius, who had been consul 7 years before, and which was greater honor to him than the consulship. Brother to that Titius Philemenius, who overthrew King Philip. The reason he had for his expulsion was this: Lucius, it seemed, took along with him in all his commands a youth whom he had kept as his companion from the flower of his age, and to whom he gave as much power and respect as to the chiefest of his friends and relations. Now it happened that Lucius, being consular governor of one of the provinces, the youth setting himself down by him, as he used to do, among other flatteries with which he played upon him, when he was in his cups, told him he loved him so dearly that, though there was a show of gladiators to be seen at Rome, and I, he said, had never beheld one in my life, and though I, as it were, longed to see a man killed, and yet I made all possible haste to come to you. Upon this, Lucius, returning his fondness, replied, Do not be melancholy on that account. I can remedy that, ordering therefore forthwith one of those condemned to die to be brought to the feast, together with the headsman, and he axed the youth if he wished to see him excused. The boy, answering that he did, Lucius commanded the executioner to cut his neck, and this several historians mention, and Cato, indeed, in his dialogue de Senectute, Senectute, introduces Cato, relating it himself, but Livy says that he was killed by a Gaulish deserter. I occasionally see something needs was killed by a Gaulish deserter, and that Lucius did not execute him by the stroke of an executioner, but with his own hand, and that it is so stated in Cato's speech. Lucius, being thus expelled out of the Senate by Cato, his brother took it very ill, and appealing to the people, desired that Cato should declare his reasons, and when he began to relate this transaction of the feast, Lucius endeavored to deny it, but Cato, challenging him to a formal investigation, he fell off and refused it, so that he was then acknowledged to suffer deservedly afterwards. However, when there was some show at the theatre, he passed by the seats where those who had been consuls used to be placed, and taking his seat a great way off, excited the compassion of the common people, who presently with a great noise made him go forward, and as much as they could try to set right and salve over what had happened. Manilius also, who according to the public expectation would have been next consul, he threw out of the Senate, because in the presence of his daughter and in open day he had kissed his wife. He said that, as for himself, his wife never came into his arms except when there was a great thunder, so that it was for jest with him, that it was a pleasure for him when Jupiter thundered. His treatment of Lucius, likewise, the brother of Scipio, and one who had been honored with the triumph, occasioned some odium against Cato, for he took his horse from him, and was thought to do it with a design of putting an affront on Scipio Africanus, now dead, but he gave most general annoyance by retrenching people's luxury, for though most of the youth being thereby already corrupted, it seemed almost impossible to take it away with an open hand and directly, yet going as it were obliquely around, he caused all dress, carriages, women's ornaments, household furniture, whose price exceeded 1,500 drachmas, to be rated at 10 times as much as they were worth, intending by thus making the assessments greater, to increase the taxes paid upon them. He also ordered that upon every 1,000 donkeys of property of this kind, 3 should be paid, so that people burdened with these extra charges, and seeing others as of good estates, but more frugal and sparing, paying less into the public exchequer, might be tried out of their prodigality. And thus, on the one side, not only those were disgusted at Cato, who bore the taxes for the sake of luxury, but those, too, who on the other side laid by their luxury for fear of the taxes. For people in general reckon that in order not to display the riches is equivalent to the taking away of the riches, because riches are seen much more in superfluous than in necessary things. Indeed, this was what excited the wonder of Ariston, the philosopher, that we count those who possess superfluous things more happy than those who abound with what is necessary and useful. But when one of his friends asked Scopas, the rich Thessalian, to give him some article of no great utility, saying that it was not a thing that he had any great need or use for himself. In truth, replied he, it is just these useless and unnecessary things that make my wealth and happiness. Thus the desire of riches does not proceed from a natural passion within us, but arises rather from vulgar, out-of-doors opinion of other people. Cato, notwithstanding, being little solicitous as to those who exclaimed against him, increased his austerity. He caused the pipes through which some persons brought the public water into their houses and gardens to be cut, and threw down all buildings which jutted out into the common streets. He beat down also the price in contracts for public works to the lowest, and raised it in contracts for farming the taxes to the highest sum, by which proceedings he drew a great deal of hatred upon himself. Those who were of Titus Flaminius's party cancelled in the Senate all the bargains and contracts made by him for the repairing and carrying on of the sacred and public buildings as unadvantageous to the commonwealth. They incited also the boldest of the tribunes of the people to accuse him and to fine him 2 talents. They likewise much opposed to him in building the court or basilica, which he caused to be erected at the common charge, just by the Senate house in the marketplace, and called by his own name the Porcian. However, the people, it seems, liked the censorship wondrously well, for setting up a statue for himself in the temple of the female entity of health, well, they consider this entity a goddess, but, well, they had words. This word meant this, and this was a different thing. They put an inscription under it, not recording his commands in war or his triumph, but to the effect that this was Cato, the censor, who by his good discipline and wise and temperate ordinances reclaimed the Roman commonwealth when it was declining and sinking down into vice. Before this honor was done to himself, he used to laugh at those who loved such kind of things, saying that they did not see that they were taking pride in the workmanship of brass founders and painters, whereas the citizens bore about his best likeness in the breasts, and when any seemed to wonder that he should have neither a statue, while many ordinary persons had one, I would, said he, much rather be asked why I have not one, than why I have one. In short, he would not have any honest citizen endure to be praised, except it might prove advantageous to the commonwealth. Yet still he had passed the highest commendation on himself, for he tells us that those who did anything wrong and were found fault with used to say it was not worth while to blame them, for they were not Catos. I don't know how it's spelled in Greek. It might be Satos or something. He also adds that they who awkwardly mimicked some of his actions were called left-handed Catos, and that the Senate in perilous times would cast their eyes on him as upon a pilot in a ship, and that often when he was not present, they put off affairs of greatest consequence. These things are indeed also testified of him by others, for he had a great authority in the city, alike for his life, his eloquence, and his age. He was also a good father, an excellent husband to his wife, and an extraordinary economist. And as he did not manage his affairs of this kind carelessly, as things of little moment, I think I ought to record a little further whatever was commendable in him. In these points, he married a wife more noble than rich, being of opinion that the rich and the highborn are equally haughty and proud, but that those of noble blood would be more ashamed of base things, and consequently more obedient to their husbands in all that was fit and right. Surah 60, the Quran, has the same thing. What's good and fair, basically. As opposed, the Bible kicks women down a notch and says that they should obey even in wickedness and that sort of stuff. Pauline Christianity does, anyways. A man who beat his wife, our child, laid violent hands, he said, on what was most sacred, and a good husband he reckoned worthy of more praise than a great senator, and he admired the ancient Socrates for nothing so much as for having lived a temperate and contented life with a wife who was a scold and children who were half-witted. As soon as he had a son born, though he had never such urgent business upon his hands, unless it were some public matter, he would be by when his wife washed it and dressed it in its swaddling clothes, for she herself suckled it. Nay, she often too gave her breast to her servants' children to produce, by suckling the same milk, a kind of natural love in them to her son. When he began to come to years of discretion, Cato himself would teach him to read, although he had a servant. A very good grammarian called Cato, who taught many others, but he thought not fit, as he himself said, to have his son reprimanded by a slave, are pulled, it may be, by the ears when found tardy in his lesson, nor would he have him owe to a servant the obligation of so great a thing as his learning. He himself, therefore, as we were saying, taught him his grammar, law, and his gymnastic exercises, nor did he only show him, too, how to throw a dart, to fight in armor, and to ride, but to box also, and to endure both heat and cold, and to swim over the most rapid and rough rivers. He says likewise that he wrote histories in large characters with his own hand, so that his son, without stirring out of the house, might learn to know about his countrymen and forefathers. Nor did he less abstain from speaking anything obscene before his son, than if it had been in the presence of the sacred virgins called vestals. Nor would he ever go into the bath with him, which seems indeed to have been the common custom of the Romans. Sons-in-law used to avoid bathing with fathers-in-law, disliking to see one another naked, but having in time learned of the Greeks to strip before men, They have since taught the Greeks to do it, even with the women themselves. And see but we find that like feral children. Well, I mean, that's very very rare, but people naturally cover, knees to the belly at the very least, regardless of the weather. And we find that mythologies were invented, and nowadays it's ideologies. Modesty isn't body shaming. Calls to modesty aren't body shaming. Calls to behaving yourself in one way or another are not phobic or something, right? Thus, like an excellent work, Cato formed and fashioned his son to virtue, nor had he any occasion to find fault with his readiness and docility, but as he proved to be of too weak a constitution for hardships, he did not insist on requiring of him any very austere way of living. However, though delicate in health, he proved a stout man of the field, and behaved himself valiantly when Pallas Aemilius fought against Perseus, where, when his sword was struck from him by a blow, or rather slipped out of his hand by reason of its moistness, he so keenly resented it that he turned to some of his friends about him, and taking them along with him, again fell upon an enemy, and having, by a long fight and much force, cleared the place, at length found it among great heaps of arms, and the dead bodies of friends as well as enemies, piled one upon another, upon which Pallas, his general, much commended the youth, and there is a letter of Cato's to his son, which highly praised his honorable eagerness for the recovery of his sword. Afterwards he married Tertia, Aemilius, Pallas's daughter, and sister to Scipio, nor was he admitted into this family less for his own worth than his father's, so that Cato's care in his son's education came to a very fitting result. He purchased a great many slaves out of the captives taken in war, but chiefly brought up the young ones, who were capable to be, as it were, broken and taught like whelps and colts. None of these ever entered another man's house, except sent either by Cato himself or his wife. If any one of them were asked what Cato did, they answered merely that they did not know. When a servant was at home, he was obliged either to do some work or sleep, for indeed Cato loved those most who used to lie down, often to sleep, accounting them more docile than those who were wakeful, and more fit for anything when they were refreshed with a little slumber, being also of opinion that the great cause of the laziness and misbehavior of slaves was the running after their pleasures. He fixed a certain price for them to pay for permission amongst themselves, but would suffer no connections out of the house. At first, when he was but a poor soldier, he would not be difficult in anything which related to his eating, but looked upon it as a pitiful thing to quarrel with a servant for the belly's sake. The belly rumbles too now. But afterwards, when he grew richer, and made any feasts for his friends and colleagues in office, as soon as supper was over, he used to go with a leather thong and scourge those who had waited or dressed the meat carelessly. He also contrived, too, that a servant should have some differences one among another, always suspecting and fearing a good understanding between them. Those who had committed anything worthy of death, he punished if they were found guilty by the verdict of their fellow servants. But being, after all, much given to the desire of gain, he looked upon agriculture rather as a pleasure than profit, resolving therefore to lay out his money in safe and solid things. He purchased ponds, hot baths, grounds full of fuller's earth, remunerative lands, pastures, and woods, from all which he drew large returns, nor could Jupiter himself, he used to say, do much damage to him. He was also given to the form of usury, which is considered most odious in traffic by sea, and that thus he desired that those whom he put out his money to should have many partners when The number of them and their ships came to 50. He himself took one share through Quintio, his freedman, who therefore was to sail with the adventurers and take a part in all their proceedings, so that thus there was no danger of losing his whole stock, but only a little part, and that with a great prospect of great profit. Now, so much better to help people out, and this sort of making money based on loans has been the great detriment to more and more, but modern society more than anything else. But he likewise lent money to those of his slaves who wished to borrow, with which they bought also other young ones, whom, when they had taught and bred up at his charges, they would sell again at the year's end, but some of them Cato would keep for himself, giving just as much for them as another had offered, to incline his son to be of his kind or temper. He used to tell him that it was not like a man, but rather like a widow woman, to lessen an estate. But the strongest indication of Cato's avaricious humor was that when he took the boldness to affirm that he was a most wonderful, nay, godlike man, who left more behind him than he had received. Now, if you take away some of the personifications and all the rest of that stuff, one finds that these divine qualities, sure, we manifest them in a limited way, but so do these gendered forms and other limitations of how people personify divine qualities limit things too. So we can be merciful, we can be just, we can be loving, we can be various, but of course people take some of this stuff too far and make a statue of me the first chance you get and all that. He was now grown old when Carneades, the academic, and Diogenes, the Stoic, came as deputies from Athens to Rome, praying for release from a penalty of 500 talents laid on the Athenians, in a suit to which they did not appear, in which the Oropians were plaintiffs and Sicaonians judges. All the more studious youth immediately waited on these philosophers, and frequently with admiration heard them speak, but the gratefulness of Carneades's oratory, whose ability was really greatest, and his reputation equal to it, gathered large and favorable audiences, and ere long filled, like a wind, all the city with the sound of it, so that it soon began to be told that a Greek famous even to admiration, winning and carrying all before him, had impressed so strange a love upon the young men, that, quitting all their pleasures and pastimes, they ran mad, as it were, after philosophy, which indeed much pleased the Romans in general, nor could they but with much pleasure see the youth receive so welcomely the Greek literature, and frequent the company of learned men. But Cato, on the other side, seeing the passion for words flowing into the city from the beginning, took it ill, fearing lest the youth should be diverted that way, and so should prefer the glory of speaking well before that of arms and doing well. But think about combining them, right? And when the fame of the philosophers increased in the city, and Caius Achilles, a person of distinction, at his own request, became their interpreter to the Senate, at their first audience, Cato resolved, under some specious pretense, to have all philosophers cleared out of the city, and coming into the Senate, blamed the magistrates for letting these deputies stay so long a time without being dispatched, though they were persons that could easily persuade the people to what they pleased, that therefore, in all haste, something should be determined about their petition, that so they might go home again to their own schools and to claim the Greek children, and leave the Roman youth to be obedient, as hitherto, to their own laws and governors. Yet he did this not out of any anger, as some think, to Carneades, but because he wholly despised philosophy, and out of a kind of pride scoffed at the Greek studies and literature, as, for example, he would say that Socrates was a prating, seditious fellow, who did his best to tyrannize over his country, and to undermine the ancient customs, and to entice and withdraw the citizens to opinions contrary to the laws. Ridiculing the school of Isocrates, he would add that his scholars grew old men before they had done learning with him, as if they were to use their art and plead causes in the court of Minos in the next world, and to frighten his son from anything that was Greek. In a more vehement tone than became one of his age, he pronounced, as it were, with the voice of an oracle, that the Romans would certainly be destroyed when they began once to be infected with Greek literature, though time indeed has shown the vanity of this his prophecy, as in truth the city of Rome has risen to its highest fortune while entertaining Grecian learning. Nor had he any aversion only against the Greek philosophers, but the physicians also, for having, it seems, heard how Hippocrates, when the king of Persia sent for him with offers of a fee of several talents, said that he would never assist barbarians who were enemies to the Greeks. He affirmed that this was now a common oath taken by all physicians, and enjoined his son to have a care and avoid them, for that he himself had written a little book of prescriptions for curing those who were sick in his family. He never enjoined fasting to anyone, but ordered them either vegetables or the meat of a duck, pigeon, or leveret. Such kind of diet being of light digestion and fit for sick folks, only it made those who ate it dream a little too much, and by the use of this kind of physic, he said, he not only made himself and those about him well, but kept them so. And that's one of the things he did is, very important too, is we got the, the oracle speaking is like, well, divination, well, it's still what you do with it, right? Spiritual brainstorming, basically. So anybody can speak with the authority of an oracle, really. They just have to admit it to themselves. However, for this, his presumption, he seemed not to have escaped unpunished, for he lost both his wife and his son, though he himself, being of a strong and robust constitution, held out longer, so that he would often, even in his old days, address himself to women, and when he was past a lover's age, married a young woman upon the following pretense: having lost his own wife, he married his son to the daughter of Pallas Aemilius, who was sister to Scipio, so that, being now a widower himself, he had a young girl who came privately to visit him. I figure they mean a young woman, but this is Greek, so we don't know. Well, I mean, can't tell here exactly. But the house being very small, and a daughter-in-law also in it, this practice was quickly discovered, for the young woman, okay, it is a young woman, that's good to a degree, seeming once to pass through it a little too boldly, the youth, his son, though he said nothing, seemed to look somewhat indignantly upon her. The old man, perceiving and understanding that what he did was disliked, without finding any fault or saying a word, went away, as his custom was, with his usual companions to the market, and among the rest he called aloud to one Silanius, who had been a clerk under him, and asked him whether he had married his daughter. He answered no, nor would he, till he had consulted him. Said Cato, then I have found out a fitting son-in-law for you, if he should not displease by reason of his age, for in all other points there is no fault to be found in him, but he is indeed, as I said, extremely old. However, Silanius desired him to undertake the business, and to give the young girl to whom he pleased, she being a humble servant of his, who stood in need of his care and patronage. Upon this Cato, without any more ado, told him that he desired to have the damsel himself,